we've decided to sort of continue our discussion that Alaskanon and myself had a couple of weeks back about Monero and Christianity. So this is sort of like a part two, but a little bit more focused and where we want to go. We want to really discuss the concept of the cult of cryptocurrency maximalism, because there is a lot of this kind of cultish feel, and I think addressing this from a biblical perspective, but then also uncovering some of the dangers of maximalism in general, I think is important. Why don't you guys introduce yourselves? Andrew, why don't you start since you're new here with us?
Yeah, I'm a Bible translation consultant based here in Oaxaca, Mexico. My wife and I have several ministries that we're engaged in. One is freehebrew.online, where we teach Hebrew to the world for free. And we do it immersively, like you learn your first language as a child. So we do that through video and everything. So that's a big part of our ministry to not only empower the global church with the biblical languages to be able to study the Bible more deeply, but also to help the Bible translation movement to have the tools and resources necessary to do faithful translations of Scripture in the different languages that still need them. So that's one part. And then sellingjesus.org is another part of our ministry to confront the commercialization of Christianity, help people think biblically about that whole sphere and the whole issue of whether we should be selling ministry or not. And we argue that ministry should be supported generously, but it should not be sold. So it's not a really controversial thing, but people tend to get really up in arms about it because we're very addicted as Westerners to monetizing everything, right? Including the sacred. So that's another part of it. And then I have a podcast called Working for the Word that is all about Bible translation. If people want kind of an inside look at what is Bible translation behind the scenes and some of the more technical aspects of it that I deal with as a consultant, they can go there and check that out. So that's a lot of fun as well. So those are a few things that we do, and it's fun.
Great. And then the famous Alaskanon in certain circles.
So I'm Alaskanon, and I love freedom and I love Jesus. And I believe that those two things are synonymous. I believe that the path to freedom is through Jesus. And I believe that the path of freedom reveals the character of Jesus, because it imposes in its own way like a self-actualization process of personal accountability, and it reveals the inerrant nature of the laws that God has set forth for all of us in our journey to freedom and finding his ways. So that drew me to Monero. So I've become like an unofficial spokesperson for Monero, not because I'm a Monero maximalist, but I just believe that it's the best thing that we have right now. And I've spent a lot of time recently uh, trying to demaximalize the crypto space in general, because it has deviated from its original philosophical principles in certain circles. And that's why I'm very grateful to be joined by these two gentlemen this morning where I am. And I'm happy to share whatever it is that I may know on this topic with this audience.
Great. Well, thanks, Jen. So, Andrew, one of the reasons I reached out to you is because I know that you're heavily involved in the kind of speaking out against the commercialization of Christianity, which I fully support. And I think it's a blind spot in the church in the West. And but sort of where I was coming from is that yes, we need to think about that, but also what are we funding missions with? And I think something like cryptocurrency provides an excellent opportunity to have better money in order to fund missions. So Andrew, I know that you are writing a book currently on Bitcoin. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about how that came to be?
Yeah, well, so there's a little bit of a backstory to that, and it's interesting and a little bit comical. But I came into the cryptocurrency space around 2015 ish, and I came into the space while I was in Africa. I was in Equatorial Guinea for 6 years, in Central Africa, doing Bible translation work, where I had very, very low internet access. And so, doing a deep dive on learning about it, as you guys know, it's a steep learning curve. And that's one of the problems with cryptocurrency still, is the confusion around so many of them, and then the steep learning curve to even understand what a blockchain is and all of that, how to use a wallet. And so that that really threw a wrench into my learning process, because I was in Africa. It was just so difficult, and there was no one around me in my vast circle of Christian acquaintances and friends. There was not a single person who I could reach out to and ask a question about this. I was basically alone in that space, and that was also frustrating. So it was kind of blindly, finding my way, um, and thinking of it more of an investment opportunity at the beginning, um, not thinking biblically about it, because I don't think any of these books had been written yet, that were trying to take a kind of a biblical spin on it. So I kind of meandered, in different ways, and didn't didn't have the resources to really understand what I was doing, what I was getting into, until later. Um, and that was when I moved out of Africa, and I had more time and more internet and all of that kind of thing. So uh, I became more focused on Bitcoin, and I think a lot because of the louder voices around Bitcoin out there, and there was just very hard to find people like you out there talking about Monero and other alternatives and really arguing cogently for them. I read the book The Cryptopians. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that one. But honestly, it's all about Ethereum and its birth, and all of the drama that went on behind the scenes about it, the people involved. To me, it was really ugly, to be honest, looking behind the scenes. And I liked what the Bitcoin maximalists call the sort of um, immaculate conception of Bitcoin, in that sense. Where it's not tied up in a certain personality that is riddled with all of these kind of sinful tendencies and maybe selfish ambitions.
Mhm.
So that part of the Bitcoin narrative that is put forward appealed to me, and I didn't have any strong reasons to question it at the time. And like I said, I was still in a vacuum of influences. There weren't people like you in my life. I would meet people all the time, Christians, programmers who were Christians, people I thought were really techie, would be into Bitcoin or would actually know more about cryptocurrency, and I never found anyone.
Mhm.
And so I just had no one to kind of bounce these ideas off of. And so for, the past 2 years or so, I've been pretty focused on Bitcoin, and just because of the confusion, I think partly there's just so much, like, where are you going to start with all the other options out there? And I had never heard a strong voice about Monero either, um, especially from a Christian perspective. So all that to say, um, I'm pretty new to Monero in my learning curve, and so I'm here to learn from you guys. Um, I have learned a lot about Bitcoin. I am just now learning about Bitcoin Cash because of Roger Vere's book. Um, I I really find it unfortunate that no one ever. I found the hijacking of Bitcoin book really late in the game, so I'm just talking about like a matter of maybe a month ago that I read that book. And I found it completely by the providence of God, what other people would call totally random. Um, no one recommended it to me. Of course, I never heard it on any of these Bitcoin maximalist podcasts referred to at all, even referenced in a negative sense or something. And so I'm kind of in this limbo period right now where I had this strong focus. I thought I was settled on Bitcoin. Like this is the best way to go. And now I'm retracing all of that and revisiting all of that and having a lot of these presuppositions challenged. That's not a fun place to be honest. But Bitcoiners and Christians, we claim to love truth and want to follow the truth. And Roger Vere's book, to me, had the ring of truth on every page, and I haven't found a reason to challenge his arguments and his evidence, which is really unsettling because of how much time and energy I've invested in that space, right? Um, so that's where I'm at right now. So it's not where you guys are at all. So basically, I was writing this book, and I'm pretty much going to have to scrap, I think, I don't know, 60-80% of it, and start over at some point. And maybe it will never come out. We'll see. But yeah, it was an attempt to really bring people to the table, to have a God-centered, Bible-saturated, Christ-exalting perspective on Bitcoin. And just, I think a lot of it is exposing it. The valuable stuff still stands. The valuable stuff is exposing the evil of the current system, right?
Mm.
And we can all, we're all, everybody in the crypto space is pretty much unified on that point.
Yeah.
And that's an important point to challenge and help people think biblically about. And so that's a big part of the book too. Anyways, sorry, I've talked probably too long.
No, well, I think it's helpful for us to understand the context in which you're operating in. And look, I think it's just going to make a better book at the end of the day, being able to change your
Oh.
views based on what you're saying. And ask on, how did you get started into the crypto space? Because I imagine it probably was started with Bitcoin as well. I think that's where everyone starts, right? But I don't know, what can you maybe outline your sort of journey into the crypto space?
So actually, no, that's not where my crypto journey
Okay.
starts. Well, the first thing I would say to Andrew, though, is if you're going to write a book directed to the Christian community, it's invaluable for you to go through the same journey that most of them do. So that's probably the most important element of writing a book trying to reach the Christian community, because it is, for one, it's a cesspool of lies. And then for two, inside of it all, there are rubies of value to be gleaned that are incredible. If you remember from our first interview, I am thoroughly convinced that there are elements of this technology that, if we were to use them in a biblically and responsible way, would set a lot of people free to things that seem overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
Like we talked about, like college debt and
Yeah.
the housing crisis and all that. As far as I can tell, buried within this crypto world would be solutions to these problems that are shockingly easy, but there's a certain moral obligation for us to follow Christian principles to unlock those sorts of things. And that's just a theory, but
Mm-hmm.
my journey into cryptocurrency actually goes back before Bitcoin even existed. So I was already a very paranoid individual, because when I was very, very young, I had watched the Waco and Ruby Ridge situation and all of these other things. So I was already very, very skeptical of things like government power and money and so on. I also grew up poor, and I was very interested in what money was and how it worked. So I was fortunate enough to be steered towards the inner workings of these systems before Bitcoin even existed. So I was part of some of these cryptography newsletters.
Mm.
And even though I didn't get the Bitcoin white paper like as it came out, I was reading it pretty shortly after. And
Wow.
because I knew what I did about, the way that government systems work, the foundations of the paper, like the philosophical elements of the paper, rang really strongly with me. and I was already very interested in math and cryptography, so I had a decent cursory understanding of what was being proposed here. But the other thing is I was fascinated by the work of David Chaum, which I would point out would probably be a pretty good candidate for who Satoshi Nakamoto is. I'm not saying that is the case, but he goes back to the original invention of what you would think of as digital cash, from a 1982 paper called "Computer Systems Established, Maintained, and Trusted by Mutually Suspicious Groups," which is a mouthful. But the reason why he wrote it was, how would you build a system where parties that don't trust each other can use a computing system that can be trusted, which is probably the most difficult element of building what today we think of as cryptocurrency. So I was already very fascinated by all of there's nothing new in Bitcoin. It's actually the congealing of multiple technologies and making it a system that could work together, which in itself is an investment for sure, in invention for sure, and making them play nice together is also incredible. But all of the different components I was already very interested in. So following that encounter, I jumped in both feet into big. I was also really young, so relatively speaking. So I was all about Bitcoin, and I very early on saw how this could theoretically be the anti-state money. Um, but what most people would consider early, but for the people who were already in that space, it didn't really feel such. It was probably around 2013 or 2014, and once again, I was a little late to the party because I was always trying to weed through this stuff. But let's say 2014, maybe 2015, a lot of people were pointing out the major privacy problems with Bitcoin. Now, people knew that those existed. Satoshi even talks about it in some of his writings. But the concept that the computing power and the value required to make it something that people would do hadn't quite set in yet. So, as all of the sudden Bitcoin is starting to become very valuable, and computing power is continuing on its rapid growth in efficiencies and computing power that's available to the general public, there were some people that were questioning Moore's law at the time. I was unfortunately one of them. It was just hard for me to imagine how computing power could continue on that rate of improvement. Now it makes more sense to me. But I was more skeptical about the idea of the necessary computing power for reverse engineering people's transactions. And I was also very skeptical about this idea that people were just going to dive into a centralized exchange to do all of their Bitcoin stuff. Because early, everybody was a cypherpunk. Everybody was, self custody and doing their own mining. And it didn't make sense that the culture would pivot so hard until we started to see the infiltration, until we started to see what's called, I think people kind of branded it the block size wars or whatever you want to call it. But I was blown away that people would oppose the idea of growing the block size or coming up with better solutions to keep it money. And that was a huge eye opener to me, that, okay, this is definitely becoming compromised, because there was no technical or philosophical logic, if you were a cypherpunk, to this idea that you wouldn't want to keep it cash. And but there were people who were on the other side, and a lot of them. And that was when I really started to question where this community had gone. And I also noticed that other crypto projects were coming along, and the ethos in the really, really early days, everybody was all about everybody else's crypto projects. The idea that you would end up being a Bitcoin maximalist, there was a lot of people that assumed that you would continue pegging the value of the other ones to Bitcoin until maybe something better than Bitcoin came along. That was the idea, or at least I thought that was everybody's idea. But that ended up not being the case, where Bitcoin maximalism started to emerge. And it can sound a little spiteful, but so I've always been kind of a big guy. And I've always been kind of socially fluid. And I've also always been interested in nerd stuff, right? Dungeons and Dragons and, fantasy books and philosophy and all that. And I watched over and over again as people who would be socially ostracized because they were nerds, and they seemed very close. But then maybe they start going to the gym with me or whatever, and all of a sudden they're attractive, or they learn how to be more social or something like that. And they immediately reject the community that they come from, and they can't wait to get their seat at the cool kids table. And the reason why I bring that up is because that happened on a macroscopic level with
Mhm.
Bitcoin. It's something that I recognized from my childhood, but it was the adult version where these people started to get gains. These people started to get major jobs with Silicon Valley, tech bro, whatever. And all of the philosophies that they were preaching just immediately went in the trash, like it never even existed. And they could not resist the gains. And I think we see that uh, exhaustively in the Christian community, where people who are knowledgeable and they have some success with maybe a book or something like that, they can't wait to sell out, even though everything that came out of their mouth was in alignment with what scripture would teach. Which is cool that a guy such as yourself, who is kind of already on that crusade, then sees the same thing happening in the tech bro space, where there are these beautiful philosophies tied into the crypto ecosystem. And out of one side of their mouth, they're talking a very Christian game, the idea of sound money and integrity. And I think you probably heard me talk about before on the previous podcast. This has the power to virtually eliminate theft as we know it. Not that theft will go away, but things like Monero, and in theory, it could be Bitcoin, but it's not going to be for the reasons that I think we've covered before. But this has the ability to make the cost of theft exponentially higher, which should be something that the biblical communities would be very interested in. It has the power to make murder more expensive and a lot of other things that we should all be championing as Christians. We want to see the world to be more in alignment with Christian values. And Bitcoin was using a lot of those same philosophies. Look, it's really hard to steal. Look, it's sound money and all of these other biblical principles out of one side of their mouth. But then on the other side, they can't wait to cram as many tokens and coins into a centralized exchange so they can borrow money and leverage it and all of these other obscenely anti Christian ideas. And it's everything that the early adopters would have been completely revolted by. And some of those are the same people, which is the scariest part of all. And like you said, Roger Ver, a guy who was an early adopter, and I mean, there's slip ups, right? Everybody's human. Like thinking a project might be a good idea and it turns out to be a scam or whatever. But that's the thing about new spaces. A lot of people want to absolutely crucify this man for a couple of bad predictions or whatever. Well, as soon as you can prove to me that you have no bad predictions, maybe I'll take you up on that, right? Like, but he's done everything he can to live his principles, and the community that he helped build, the community that he grew to the size that it is, along with all of the others that he never really turned his back on, can't wait to see him go under just because he took a different position on the block size wars and so on. So what that tells me is the Christian voice in this space is effectively silent. And I would like to see that change,
Amen.
because the Christian voice has the power to, well, the Holy Spirit has the power through the Christian voice to set this ship back on a course that could lead to actual human freedom and actual prosperity. But we'll see where it goes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see a lot of overlap between the Reformation and our current day, where 500 years ago we had a centralized institution that was commercializing Christianity. There's this new form of technology, the printing press, that came about. There was social changes, and I really feel like we need another reformation. We need another financial reformation, a spiritual reformation, where Christians say,
Mhm.
look, we need to stop commercializing Christianity, and we need to use better money. The Bible's clear what it talks about, honest weights and scales, like our previous conversation that people can check out. So I'm super excited to have these conversations, and yes, we need more of them. So I really hope that people listening can hear what we're saying, and spread this, and bring it to your pastor, bring it to people that close friends of yours who are Christians, and start having these conversations. Now, let's maybe define what crypto maximalism is. To be honest, I thought the whole Bitcoin maximalism was sort of a meme until I actually started encountering them online. I was like, whoa, okay, this is actually a real thing. These people are like super cult like. So I don't, Andrew, maybe do you want to maybe give a definition? Then Alaskanon, you can maybe give a definition or some of your experiences you've had with any type of maximalism, but we could maybe focus on Bitcoin because it's the biggest.
I mean, as I understand it, they claim, this is the first one, it's the only one, and everything else is an SHIT coin. And yeah, I mean, they basically claim that everything else is not decentralized and everything else is a scam, essentially a Ponzi scheme or whatever else. And you know, they're they never address they never really get into the weeds about addressing like how exactly is Bitcoin Cash more centralized than BTC. But anyways, yeah, that's how I understand it, but it's not a very sophisticated definition.
So I would define crypto maximalism as whatever the fundamental use case of the cryptocurrency or the blockchain actually is. Anything that goes outside of that, and I think an example is best. So if you're trying to make a cryptocurrency, so it's meant to be a unit of account, claims or ideologies or adding certain virtues to your your tech that is outside of the scope of the underlying architecture of the blockchain or the crypto, that would be maximalism. So an easy one would be Bitcoin still claims to be digital cash, but it's clearly lost almost every element of being a transactional unit of account. So to call it a cryptocurrency or digital cash is crypto maximalism, because that's not true anymore. Now, maybe there's an argument for store of value, or maybe there's an argument for whatever. But another good example would be, so I'm from the Monero community mostly, and Monero, I believe, is an effective unit of account, and it's an effective cryptocurrency. And therefore, you could use it as a savings vehicle. However, if you were to use it as a savings vehicle outside of the scope, I'm going to sell my house so I can have more Monero. I'm going to sell my, my gold because I can get more Monero. That would be a cultish maximalistic behavior, because Monero, the underlying architecture is it is a unit of account. And unit of accounts should be a vehicle by which you're accruing assets that you expect to add more value to your life than the unit of account. That would be a cult like maximalistic behavior. But there are other cryptocurrencies. So smart contracts. Smart contracts, most of the time, they're not attempting to be a cryptocurrency. But there are people that try to impose the virtues of a liquid peer-to-peer digital cash on something that's not designed for that. That would be maximalism. Or this idea that a cryptocurrency is going to replace things or systems that work better, when it's not even to a point where it can be adopted by a normal person. So Andrew had mentioned earlier the learning curve. I believe that Monero has one of the lowest learning curves by far, and it is still completely out of the reach of most people. And part of that has to do with the systems that they're used to are outside of the scope of their a crypto would be outside of the scope of their knowledge base. Fair enough. But some of that is still built into the tech. So I can see the excuse of it's just like using your bank account, but because the interface is a little different, there's a learning curve. Okay, we've all had to do that. We all had to learn email. We all had to learn smartphones. That's one thing. But when you have to explain to somebody, hey, Monero has these block lock times, that's something completely new that is specific to Monero and other cryptocurrencies. So that adds to the learning curve. A maximalist is somebody who will just step right over that fundamental reality of crypto, which is the learning curve is too high, therefore it is not what you're talking about. This idea of mass adoption. People talk about Bitcoin's mass adoption when it's a handful of people, relatively speaking, talking to a handful of people, and then a half a billion other people watching it on CNN, thinking that I go buy a Bitcoin and then it just gains value, and then I sell that Bitcoin and I pocket the dollars. They're not thinking of Bitcoin as money. They're not thinking of Bit. So there's these multiple realities in the minds of people about what Bitcoin is, and none of them comport to what Bitcoin actually is. That is maximalism. When your worldview of a crypto, as an example, is completely deviant from the actual reality of said crypto. Now, I would like to put a caveat into that. There are a lot of people who see realistic potential in a certain crypto. So, once again, since I'm from the Monero community, I'll use that as an example. Bitcoin has virtually no privacy. Monero has an incredible amount of privacy. But there is a move towards even more perfect privacy with full chain membership proofs. Now that is an upgrade from a very, very, very large amount of privacy to even significantly more privacy. I would not consider the view of looking at Monero as though it has full chain membership proofs now, even though it doesn't, as maximalism, simply because the code is written. It has been proven to work in test nets, and it's being audited by other professionals right now. And it was written by people with the talent and the knowledge to write it effectively. So it is not maximalism to look into the near future, as long as it remains practical and grounded in reality, to see your crypto or whatever it is now as what its near future potential is. But you also need to be couching that when you're talking to other people with the fact that this is a very high degree of likelihood. It's not a reality yet, but it's a reasonable expectation. So I don't want to throw people under the bus who see the potential. Here's another example, even though I'm not an Ethereum person, right? Ethereum continues to evolve in such a way where it is capable of more and more things in the realm of smart contracts and so on. So predicting the continued progression of that is not maximalism, because you have a long history of seeing that progression. You have a reasonable expectation of continuing to see that progression. However, if you take that progression and say, we can replace all of the governments of the world with smart contracts, which I wouldn't even be opposed to, but the idea that a handful of developers on Web3 are going to be able to create a smart contract that can be adopted by the Luddite non-techies of the entire world. And it's going to replace everything they know about their current reality. And they're just going to be okay with this. Is clearly maximalism. It's delusional. It's outside of the scope of anything that could be reasonably produced. So the short version of what I just said is crypto maximalism is going outside of the reality of your tech and imposing delusional pseudo realities onto your tech and then becoming a cultist because of those delusions. I don't think it's delusional to say Monero is better money. We could all switch to Monero and we'd have a better world. That's not delusional. However, to say we are all going to switch to Monero, it's an inevitability, which I see that, is completely delusional. And that is Monero maximalism.
Mm.
And it's depressing because that's wasted energy when you could be actively trying to produce a better world and instead you're ranting like a lunatic on Twitter.
I'll give you another example of Monero maximalism that maybe you haven't considered, but something that I've noticed. And I think it's to do with thinking that if I use Monero, then I've checked the privacy checkbox, and now there we go, privacy done. And I think it's the first step to having robust online privacy. But that's something that has to be continued with using VPNs and changing operating systems. And there's a lot more to do. Monero is a great first step. But I think it kind of neglects the importance of metadata. And there's a fascinating book written by a gentleman who was pivotal in cracking the Enigma code during World War II. His name is Gordon Welshman, and he wrote a book called The Hut 6 Story, Breaking the Enigma Code. And this is a quote from the beginning of his book, and I'll read it here. So he said, "My study of how the Germans made it possible for us to break a cipher machine that would have been unbreakable if properly used proves that if we are to achieve security, we must pay careful attention to the indoctrination, training, and monitoring of all personnel involved." And Hut 6 eventually, which was based in this place called Bletchley Park, eventually turned to GCHQ, which is the British equivalent of the NSA. And what he's saying here is that they were able to break the Enigma code, not because they broke its ciphers. They broke it by monitoring its traffic, essentially the metadata, who was sending messages to who. And then they were able to, through human error, people using it incorrectly, they were able to then chip away at the code, which then allowed them to develop techniques to eventually consistently break the code. But it wasn't because the cipher was bad. It was because of human error and traffic analysis. And you can continue this idea of metadata and its importance in the roles today. There was a debate at the Johns Hopkins University called "The Price of Privacy: Reevaluating the NSA," where a former director of the CIA and NSA, General Michael Hayden, says publicly that the CIA makes kill commands based on metadata alone.
It's a law that allows the government to get any business records on anybody, and in their interpretation, literally anybody and everybody. And so they could get email records, who you've emailed, who's emailing you, what websites you're searching, what searches you put into Google. All of that goes to businesses, which then have those records, and under the NSA's theory of how American law should run, they can get any and all of that information, because it might happen that at some point, some of it might be useful to try to find a terrorist. To me, that's dragnet surveillance at its worst, and the distinction between content and metadata really is erased.
Is erased. And this is all done under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court is the secret court that weighs, as I said, in secret, the legal justification for putting together a search of metadata linked to a person or persons, and then gives it an okay or not okay, and it is on a time limit. General Hayden, you can find out all these things David just said about me, about David, about anyone in this audience. That is a function of operational capability. I'd like you to talk about whether you're comfortable with that operational capability. If so, why? And how often is it used in the ways that David described?
Yeah, first of all, David's description of what you can do with metadata, and quoting a mutual friend, Stuart Baker, is absolutely correct. Okay, we kill people based on metadata.
So it shows you that, this idea of I just use Monero, that's it. My privacy is done is sort of a misdemeanor, because there's metadata and so many other ways in which you can be tracked and traced. But so I do think maximalism can sort of express itself in that way in the Monero community. Another way is also like plausible deniability. A lot of people think that, oh, we need plausible deniability, but I think they are presupposing, or they're assuming that a totalitarian regime that's coming after you actually cares about plausible deniability. There's something we're seeing with Roger Ver right now is clearly the law doesn't matter. They're sort of just bending the law in order to persecute and do, conduct lawfare. So with that in mind, I do see in the space, Andrew, coming back to what you're saying, this idea with the Bitcoin maximalism, in that it's either Bitcoin or nothing else, right? So it's Bitcoin or it's a scam. And the sad reality is that largely is the case. There's a lot of cryptocurrencies which are just pump and dumps. They're rug pulls, they're scams. And I almost feel like, is that intentional? Is it to scare the kind of normies away? It's like, oh, all cryptocurrencies a scam, but I'll give this Bitcoin thing a shot because it's the first one, and it seems to be the most robust, and everyone's talking about how much money they made with it. So I don't know. It kind of reminds me of Star Wars. I don't know if you're familiar with these films, but the third film where Obi-Wan Kenobi turns to his previous Padawan, Anakin Skywalker, who has turned to the Sith. He's like, you were supposed to destroy the Sith, not join them. And I feel like that's what Bitcoin has become. It was supposed to destroy the banking system, but it has just kind of merged right into it.
You were the chosen one! It was said that you would destroy this!
International banking cartel?
Not join them!
And as Alaskanon, you said, because of its lack of privacy, it actually furthers the technocratic surveillance state that we are sort of moving towards. And so that's how I discovered Monero, was actually noticing the weaknesses of Bitcoin and then seeing that there was alternatives. And I just assumed that it was private. And then actually, so there's these ones called, crypto coins. But yeah, a lot kind of unraveled there. But yeah, I think maximalism is also in the Monero community. We have to be aware of that. But I also think there's probably a shadowy agenda, if I'm going to be honest, of keeping that maximalist cult mentality alive, because it's beneficial to getting people to ignore other currencies and to jump into, you could say, a honeypot, which is Bitcoin. What do you guys think about that?
I think that one of the things at the root of that is personal financial interest. All of these people have a great deal of interest if the number goes up for them, their investments in Bitcoin. Michael Saylor being one of them, right? If you've got billions and billions of dollars wrapped up in Bitcoin, you're going to be one of the most passionate people. You're going to talk about Bitcoin in terms of transcendent immortality, that kind of stuff. I mean, this is one of the things I've noticed in the maximalist community is they have this kind of transcendent view of Bitcoin as a godlike element in their worldview. It's in a large sense, it's a messiah for them. And you hear this kind of language. Sometimes they'll be talking about they'll use the Bible as an excuse to defend Bitcoin, their Bitcoin maximalism. But other times it is the Bible for them. It is the Messiah for them in and of itself. And they talk in such glowing terms about its indestructibility, and it's basically all powerful. It's omnipotent for them, and it's got this immaculate conception, like Seyfuddin talks about, Um, and it ticks all the boxes of a Messiah, leading them out of Egypt as well, an exodus from the nation state's corruption. And in a sense, Bitcoin is a and we could just say cryptocurrency in general. It is an answer. It is a Moses sent to the people in slavery. But we can't confuse the Moses for the God, right? And that's, I think, what happens. The conflation between Bitcoin as a rescuer and the true God who made it possible, who brought it into existence. And so this kind of worship, and I think probably Michael Saylor, in my experience, and maybe Robert Breedlove, are the people who have the most tendency to attribute this kind of godlike character to it. Um, and I mean, it is appealing to a lot of people in that sense, right? Because everyone's looking for something to worship, and a lot of the people who are angry at the state and angry at the kinds of things that have gone on, especially in the past 2-3 years, politically and whatever else, they're looking for a new leader, a new place to worship, and when they find these kind of high priests who are saying this is the only way, it's attractive, I think, to a lot of people, especially people who want to focus. They just want to say, somebody tell me where to put all of my adoration. You know,
Mm.
uh, I don't want to split it up over 1,000 cryptocurrencies. Just give me one place, one altar, and I'll go there. You know.
The monotheism of cryptocurrency rather than the polytheism. Yeah, well, you also see this in that it gets pretty nasty, right? When people are defending Bitcoin, because you are touching the apple of their eye, you're touching their golden idol, because they have
Mhm.
a financial interest to keep Bitcoin valuable in terms of its connection to the US dollar. And if you
Mhm.
are introducing a alternative, then you're now directly tapping into their investments. And you kind of see this kind of like demonic
Right. You're an
anger
immediate
be
threat to
evoked.
their wallet. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. To their pocketbook.
It
Yeah.
reminds me of, last time
The-
Ascalon and myself spoke, we kind of investigated Matthew 25 and talked about the parable of the talents. And there was this gentleman who hid his talent in the ground. And after that conversation, it reminded me of Joshua chapter 7, where you have Achan after the battle of Jericho. He, you know, Joshua is not winning campaigns, and he cries out to God, why? It's like, oh, because, there's sin in the camp, and they cast lots, and it falls on this guy called Achan. And it turns out that he has taken something from Jericho, a golden idol, which actually it's from Babel, as in when you look at the original language, and he hid it in the ground. And again, if you look at the Septuagint, the word for hid is cryptos. He encrypted it in the ground. So I think there's a connection here between this account and Matthew 25. It's kind of interesting that we have this kind of connection, and it's kind of like this devilish appreciation of gold, which I think is being kind of immortalized in fables such as The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. This kind of corrupting, corroding influence that gold has on humanity. It's almost demonic that it can kind of take people over, and they start worshiping the golden calf or the golden accursed thing that they've hidden in the ground. And Bitcoin
mhm.
is certainly sort of hitting some of these same spiritual characteristics that we've seen in the
Right.
past. It's been called precious before, but not by you.
It's mine. My own. My precious.
Precious? It's been called that before, but not by you.
My business isn't of yours when I do with my own
I
things.
think you've had that
Bitcoin.
quite long enough.
You want it for yourself.
Bitcoin maxis!
Do not take me for some conjurer of cheap tricks. I am not trying to rob you. I'm trying to help you.
Yeah. And one thing I would add is that the issue of hodling in the crypto, in the mainly the Bitcoin community, the Bitcoin maximalists, is completely antithetical to scripture, right? And it really shows that kind of godlike esteem that they have for it. like you mentioned, the Lord of the Rings, precious, they can't let go. And what value does that bring to the world? Just because you're sitting on your pile of gold. And they fail to see, like, there's those entire books and things written about this kind of thing, like Scrooge. Scrooge is not admired by history. And but basically Sailor and all of these other people are painting Scrooge to be a hero. They're saying that's the heroic thing to do. That's the wise thing to do. They're painting that in terms of wisdom. And and I think that's one of the most unfortunate things, because it gets mixed up with all of this really selfish mentality of, don't ever sell your Bitcoin, don't ever give it away, you'll never get it back. All of this kind of fear mongering for ever being generous with your Bitcoin. And maybe they see someday, 100 years from now, you'll have an AI, manage your Bitcoin fortune for you and give it away to charities or something. I don't know what they think, but um, yeah, that's completely against scripture. Go ahead, Alaskanon. I think I interrupted you.
Hey, folks, just to let you know that Andrew's recording at this point in our conversation cut out, stopped recording. We weren't aware, so we continued our conversation, but the dialogue was sort of coming to an end. So I have included the sort of final points that myself and Alaskanon bring up. But after this point, the recording of Andrew cut out.
One thing that really, to me anyway, hones in on just how religious all of this has become, and definitely chief among them is Bitcoin, is what they do to their heretics. So there's a gentleman, I've met him, he's incredible, Amir Taki. He is deeply invested in the development and growth and appreciation and betterment of Bitcoin as one can be, very early on, exceptionally knowledgeable in the tech and in the space and so on. And the Bitcoin maxi crowd has absolutely persecuted this man for extremely reasonable takes on the tech and on the community and so on. And he's tried so hard to do it in such a way as to be gentle and, so on. And these people who they could never hold a candle to this man's forest fire of knowledge on the topic. And it only takes just a cursory examination of just how deeply he understands these things, where any rational human would say to themselves, I know this tiny little amount about this tech, and I'm new to this space, and there's absolutely no way that I could possibly understand this to the depth that this guy does, because I haven't so much as read a book or anything on the topic. I'm new. I learned everything from Twitter in the last 2 months, right? And this guy was on the ground floor as a highly technically savvy individual. But they don't have that introspective nature to them. So they just go after this guy, and he's one of many. For the simplest things like, hey, maybe some privacy in Bitcoin is a good idea, or maybe the idea of ossifying the tech is a bad idea. And they go after him with the level of vitriol that you would expect a cult to go after somebody who's thinking about leaving the cult. And in a lot of ways, it's significantly more brutal than most cults, because most cults will at least start with a gentle redirection back into the cult. These people come out with the fangs and the shotguns immediately after you open your mouth and say anything at all that would, speak ill of their idol. Even way back when, if you said anything counterintuitive to the cult, pretty much 2015, 2016 is when it really started to become a cult. If you said anything at all, you were the bad guy, right? You had to be ostracized immediately. And people would even go through this weird cleansing ritual where they would go about trying to deny that they ever agreed with you about anything. So I'm so not with that guy. I've always thought he was poison. even though they have no idea who you are. And, you know, a couple of weeks ago, you were bantering about whatever, like chums, you know. So they have their cleansing ritual of when they disavow somebody, even saying, I would never even talk to his children, sort of deal. Like it's pretty bizarre. And there are a lot of people who have been through this. There's a gentleman, he's pretty public. His name is Body, right? And he's very humble when he goes about trying to, you know, share his takes on whatever, until recently when he realized it's pretty much a waste of time, right? Like he was trying so hard to help the Bitcoin crowd or whoever else succeed by, you know, giving some reasonable criticism and providing the evidence and so on. And I had just kind of gotten on Twitter as a result of the Monero talk thing, so people could reach out to me if they wanted to. And I was just kind of watching this guy because he has some really interesting stuff to say, you know. And he's like, with a lot of humility, going to these crowds and saying, you know, there's this problem with your tech, or have you considered this or whatever. And it was just fire and brimstone coming back at him, right? And you could just watch as like he slowly moved away from trying to be more polite about it and just wishing that the space would thrive, and instead just being like, yeah, these people are cultists. Like it's bizarre to see. They will slap the helping hand away as fast as they can, just to preserve the integrity of their delusions. It's horrifying.
One thing I just want to maybe wrap up with, and we can come into a landing, is the concept of Jesus said about John the Baptist, you'll know them, wisdom is justified by her children. And there's sort of an overarching principle there. It's like time justifies the wise. That's basically what it's saying. But I think another thing which justifies wisdom is your enemies. And I've noticed in the cryptocurrency space, you want to keep a close eye on what is the sort of current paradigm, those who hold power. What are they going after? Are they trying to shut down Bitcoin? Or are they trying to shut down other things? And I think that's a good indication of knowing where, what hill that we should fight on. When you understand how a lot of our interactions are monetized, it's really to do with forms of surveillance, and that our data is not a form of currency. The things that we do on the internet is valuable. So privacy is a direct cutting off of that revenue stream for a lot of folks. And there's lots of powerful interests that don't want privacy for various reasons. Either they're just commercial, or they are to actually do with population control and power. And we've already seen huge attacks. The only attacks I've already seen on Bitcoin have been with privacy tools. It's been trying to, with mixers such as Samurai Wallet and Tornado Cash, and these other tools that were designed to try and give a Bitcoin a bit of privacy. Those things have been tackled and attacked. So with that in mind, I just want to quickly discuss three types of propaganda, because I think when people think of propaganda and how the weaponization of information, they kind of think in terms of black and white. This is propaganda, this isn't propaganda. But there's really a scale of propaganda. And I'm taking this from a book written by two ex-CIA agents in the 70s. It's called The Cult of Intelligence. On page 196, they define three types of propaganda the CIA uses. One is white propaganda, and this is simply telling the truth. So a lot of marketing would fall into this, where you sort of emphasize the positive characteristics of something, but you sort of, ignore maybe the less attractive qualities or something. So that's white propaganda. Gray propaganda is probably the most effective because it's a mixing of truth and lies. So this is what we call like a limited hangout, where you sort of, there's a lot of truth in Bitcoin, but maybe there's something in here that we haven't really told you that could actually put you in danger in terms of its lack of privacy functions. And then finally, you have black propaganda. Black propaganda is just flat out lies. This could be forging of documents. This could be, false flags and those types of things. But I think that's important to understand when you're dealing with this sort of space where there is an enemy trying to attack these things, and it's attacking it on the privacy areas, not so much the cryptographic. Interesting enough, it's not really the tech; it's more so the privacy, and how that impacts people. I think that shows where the emphasis of Christians need to really be putting their attention in the space, is that privacy seems to be the thing under attack. So therefore, privacy needs to be something that I pay attention to. And privacy goes hand in hand with private property, right? When the Bible says do not steal, that it presupposes that you have property, I have property, that I can covet my neighbor's property, I can steal my neighbor's property. And when you have property, what you have with that property, the sort of intrinsic nature of it, is the authority to keep it private, if you wish. It's my car. I don't have to open it for you. It can be private. I give you access to it at my disposal because it's my property. And that's so there is this sort of presuppositional connection biblically with private ownership and privacy. And I think as we move towards systems which want to really remove our ability to own private property, the attacks on privacy are going hand in hand with that.
I think the other proof of what you're saying, something that strongly substantiates it, is our rewards in heaven are often tied to that which we freely give without expectations of glory or some kind of return. Generosity itself is what is under attack when private property and privacy are under attack. So it is a threat to a fundamental goodness of human nature when you rob an individual of their privacy and when you rob them of their private property. And it's also, if you believe that all of your increase is coming from God, as I do, maybe directly or indirectly, but God is the fundamental source of all things, and He is the master planner of all things that take place. Even when your buddy gives you something, God is in there. If you believe, as I do, that that is the case, supporting systems that would undermine privacy and private property is kind of akin to saying that God is not all powerful. Therefore, I will step in and I will handle this matter. The absolute arrogance of those who would seek to dissolve privacy and private property is incredible to me as a God-fearing Christian man, because they suppose that they can do a good job, or even more sinister, they suppose that it is their right to manage everything. So I struggle just to manage my own family. I struggle just to manage my own business. And with many, many mistakes, and by God's grace, somehow it seems to be carrying on and moving in the right direction, I think. But I consider myself like a reasonably intelligent man at managing my own situation, and it can be overwhelming at times just handling my tiny, tiny, tiny little empire here right now. And there are those that presuppose that they have the knowledge and the tools and so on, where everybody should have nothing and they should be able to manage everything. And I think we know how God feels about arrogance, especially at that level. So wouldn't it make sense for us to resist? And the only other thing that I would point out in the crypto space, as far as, so they go after the privacy for sure, and that seems to be their primary target. But there's one other thing that they seem to really hate, which is those that became independently wealthy without sacrificing their morals. So people who got big gains and are trying to exercise the freedom that they have attained with those big gains with Roger Ver leaving the country, or with other people, they just want to atomic swap their Bitcoin into Monero or something like that. They come down with the wrath of 1,000 lasers on people who are just using their gains after becoming independently wealthy. And I think that that's almost poetic, the Roach Motel nature of what these maxi cults are walking into. They are lusting after all of this wealth. And we already have all of these historical examples of that, of the very thing that they covet becoming the prison that they will live in. And they will completely ignore the warnings of history and their peers and all of these other things because their desires have completely dominated their reality. And all of the books of wisdom in the Bible have a lot to say about desire. In fact, all of the wisdom throughout history, it always comes back to monitoring your own desires and checking your own self for why is it that I covet this thing so much. And the Bible goes so far as to say, coveting anything that is not yours is a sin. So we need to try to, those that can be reached before they walk into that roach motel and can never come out, try to appeal to the wisdom of Scripture and say to them, are you being blinded by your desires? And if God chooses to have mercy on them, maybe they will come back home. Maybe they will go back to the freedoms that may have attracted them to these matters in the first place. But at least the blood is off of our hands at that point. And that is the best we can do.
Well, gents, I think we've covered a lot of ground, so I really appreciate your time. I'll put up on the screen now just ways people can connect with you. And I'm open to doing this again in the future at some point. Andrew, really hope to see your book at some stage. Would be happy to even proofread it and kind of go over it, give you my thoughts. But please stay in touch. And yeah, we'll leave it there. God bless, guys.
Swing open you ancient doors, receive your king! Kings, crowns, bones, bounty!